No, I have nothing to teach about marriage. We have to experience life. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's a 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So before we start, my shoulder is absolutely killing me. So I'm not sure how today will be, but we're going at it still. So we are still in the parable chapter of Matthew. We're still in chapter 13 of Matthew. And today Jesus gives us the last three of the seven parables he was giving us over the last 3 weeks. So he's saying to the crowds, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field that somebody would have found, and they bury it back, and then they go and sell everything they have to go and buy that field. Same way, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who they're looking for fine pearls. And when they find one that is of great value, or the translations might say of great price, they sell everything they have to buy that one pearl. And then it goes again. The kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea. And they say bring in all kind of fish. And then by the end, the fishermen and them will sit down and they will sort out which fish good, which fish are not. The ones that, and then he goes on to say that this is how it will be at the end of time too, where the angels will be sorting through everybody. And the wicked will go into the blazing furnace where there's weeping and grinding, or some translations will say gnashing of teeth. So then the way the story ends, this last paragraph, is by Jesus asking the disciples, do you understand all of this? And then they say yes. And you say, well, every scribe who becomes a disciple of the kingdom is like a householder who brings out from the storeroom both new and old. So I've been getting up to do this reflection since before we even started having these conversations. Especially because I used to do a lecture where I would describe studying theology like the first two parables. But I mean, the whole of today's story is what I find studying theology feels like. So even though most of our conversations come from me reflecting week by week, there are some scriptures where I felt like I could have lent an additional Catholic perspective to. This is before we had started all of this. And this is one of them. These scriptures are one of them. But I mean, we've already reflected on studying theology like 3 times before, in addition to talking about it throughout the time of our conversations together. And it's because I'm so interested in people who have the vocation to be a theologian. And I am passionate about helping people explore that possibility for their own selves. But a lot has changed since before we started these reflections in 2023. And for me, I suppose the biggest change has been following my vocation. Of course, in a Catholic sense, we use the word vocation to refer to God's call in our lives. So whether that means you are called to be a teacher or a plumber or a business person, whatever it might be. In the church, we believe that these callings come from God. And so we use a word that relates to the Latin word for call. And the word we use in English is vocation. If you're from the Archdiocese of Port of Spain, you've probably heard our local Archbishop talk about vocations all the time. This is Archbishop Jason Gordon. And he would talk about the little v and the big V vocations. Like the little v essentially meaning that the work God calls you to do in your life. And the big B essentially meaning who God calls us to be with our lives, whether that's to enter into religious life or married life or single life. So yeah, I suppose the most impactful change for me was following my vocation. And I don't just mean what I believe is my vocation to be a Catholic creative and a theologian. That has brought its own set of impactful changes. And all I can say is we trust God and we walk by faith. Sometimes I wonder if God gave me the wrong vocations. I mean, that was a joke, of course. God don't make mistakes. If anything, it's just the system that I'm in is wrong. As so many of us are painfully aware, the church might try at its best. It might try its best, sorry. But as much as most of the church is made up of lay people, a lot of lay people, especially church workers, in a lot of dioceses all around the world, aren't taken care of the way they take care of the church. But so it does go. Can't let the system stop us from being Christian. I mean, I know the church can do some very unfair things to the point where you can feel marginalized. But the same thing happened to Christ. I think that's how he ended up an itinerant teacher in the first place. I mean, he had the vocation, yes, but he would have come to that after he was marginalized by his religious system. At least I think so. So more than talking about my vocation to be a theologian and a creative, I'm talking about my vocation to share in married life with my now wife, Natasha Lake. So as much as I would describe theology as the field and the pearl, I would also describe marriage to a good person as the field and the pearl. Same way you can describe discovering your vocation as the parables in this story. And I'm sure a lot of other preachers and theologians have done that before. But I would still like to add a perspective to the conversation on marriage and the theology of marriage, as the case might be, based on this story. So instead of reflecting on how this story feels like studying theology, instead, let's see how this story feels like married life. Or what a vocation you have, really. I mean, I just reflecting on my own experience. Now, I have nothing to teach about marriage. Natasha and I haven't married a year yet. We'll make a year in August. If you want somebody to teach you about marriage, about what good and proper marriage is, I would refer you to a dear friend of mine who I often reference in these reflections, and that's Gloria Bertrand. Gloria will teach you about marriage, and she's teaching you from lived experience too. Where am I? My notes. Sorry, I lost my notes. Yes, Gloria is teaching you about marriage from lived experience. And I'd recommend that you ask her about her compost heap metaphor in particular. I feel like that could change a person's perspective on marriage. And to be honest, I think it could save some marriages. So yeah, I have nothing to teach you. Ask Gloria. Or ask the Archdiocesan Family Life Commission, I suppose, if you are in the Archdiocese of Port of Spain. Now, in terms of what we believe and what we teach as church, we generally believe marriage is the unification of God, a woman, and a man. What that means is that there are two people and God remains at their center as they live their lives seeking more intimate union with God together. And as we know, union with God, or theosis, coming to be one with God in this life, isn't a concept we talk about too much at this point of history in the Catholic Church. I mean, we have the theology behind it, and it's very much a part of our tradition. Like how we often talk about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. But union with God is not something that we talk about a lot for whatever reasons. You have to listen more to the Eastern traditions of Christianity for that, as opposed to our Western perspectives in Catholicism and Protestantism. And if you want to read all the ins and outs of marriage from a Catholic perspective, you could search up the Catechism online. It's free online. And you could read what the church teaches. Everything is there for anybody to read. But I'm telling you, nothing in there prepares you for the experience of marriage. All of it is truth, and what we've come to believe as church, hopefully through being a synodal church and listening to married Christians. And it's good theoretical knowledge to use as points of departure. But the words on the page, look very different in practice. If anything, what prepares you for marriage is experiencing our Catholic foundations, especially the parts about sacrifice and pouring yourself out for another person. I'm not saying the paragraphs in the Catechism on marriage don't draw from the same wisdom and the same ethos. I think it's just that throughout time, a lot of celibate religious ended up having to teach lay people how to be married. And there are some people who that can work for, and there are some people who that can't work for. Everybody is different. I remember a partner of mine asking me once last year about wedding prep. And he's a priest and a theologian too. So we got to talking about marriage. And at one point I was telling him that I didn't have a lot of good examples to look to for what good marriage ought to be. And he was like, so you still want to get married? And I was like, well, yeah, I believe in what the church teaches. So what the church teaches is wise and true. But a paragraph in the Catechism about a couple's openness to fertility isn't going to prepare you to deal with when the baby is actually on the way and the bills are piling up and insurance don't want to pay you back your money and it's not covering a lot in the first place and the work you're doing isn't earning you enough for it all. Or when we assert our family and pro-life values without proper pastoral care, ignoring the fact that a lot of women feel like pregnancy is a death sentence. And I don't doubt that Mary would have felt the same way when she realized she conceived Christ. So we talk about being pro-life, but when a woman feels like she has to make a choice between her life and the baby inside of her life, I don't think that's the time to tell her that abortion is a sin and it is wrong. We have to address wrong society first before telling a woman she's wrong. But on God in Trinidad and Tobago, like a lot of places, we still have a robust sense of community, despite all the bad. We still have a robust sense of community, especially in the church too. And families and friends come together to support one another during situations like these. And that comes from the love that people have for one another and the sacrifices that they're willing to make to benefit those whom they love. You can't get more traditional Catholic than to say to love is to will the good of the other. And our Christian foundations ought to teach us how to love others from the time we have any kind of consciousness. And we do have those precepts and tenets, right? I mean, the golden rule alone. I mean, anything in Scripture really teaches us all about how to love God and to love neighbor. So we'll be learning all those things from small, and that's what we ought to be taken into our vocations, especially when it comes to the vocation of marriage. Again, this idea of selfless loving and sacrifice and wanting good for the other and doing your best to put the other person in front of you and doing your best to try to love them as best you can. As the same, that's what we'll call self-emptying love, or what we'd call kenotic love. That's the same love that we talk about that Christ had for us when he poured out himself for us. So all this leads me to say, when it comes to your vocation, especially when it comes to something like marriage, love has to be the basis. And that love really requires us to critically reflect on our lives, to discover what God put into our heart and where God might be leading us. Like the parables give us different scenarios that lead to the same thing, that lead to that same joy, that lead to that same, well, ultimately for us, as we know, we would say union with God. And I mean, I think it's because we are all so different, so we could have different parables. We're not all on the same path. But one commonality the people in the parables all share is that they start with the same faith and hope. The treasure seeker went out hoping he found treasure. He didn't know exactly where the treasure might be, but it was normal for people to bury money in the ground back then. So he didn't know where it might be, but he knew it was somewhere. Same thing with the pearl merchant too. She didn't know whether or not she'd find valuable pearls, but she knew she could go to places where she might find them. And same thing too for the fishers, of course. They go out not knowing if they might catch anything and what they might catch. But they went to the place where they knew they would get. And then they could sort it through after that. So it's like they don't know what they'd find. The people in the parables, they don't know what they'd find. They just knew where they might find it. And when they realized what they did actually find, they changed their whole lives around and gave up everything they had to get what they wanted. Same thing too when it comes to relationships and marriage. Like, if you know me personally, you know my personality. Fairly open, don't judge too much. Plenty times anything is anything. And that's all nice and well and good, especially when it comes to the more pastoral aspect of my work. But when I was young and it came to dating, I realized that could not work. And that wasn't about me looking to change my personality or anything. It's just that I came to realize I had to be more discerning and I had to be more selective if I was hoping to find what God was calling me to, and more so, who I was called to share in marriage with. I mean, some people are lucky enough to meet their life partners very early on in their lives. I talk about like secondary school and thing. But that's definitely not the norm. I mean, I had to dig up plenty fine treasures and inspect lots of valuable pearls before eventually meeting Natasha and us going on to get married, discerning that we are called to marriage. That means there are plenty fish in the sea, right? That's something everybody will say. But you know, people have a way of saying that when you know, you know. And hopefully it's not the consequence of youth and relative inexperience. But I think it's true. When you know, you know. And you might believe when Natasha and I met her. Well, again, if you know me personally and if you know her, then you would. I mean, we met online because we had had a Zoom call together for work. But 3 days after that first meeting online, I met her randomly in a Rasta setting. And that's in a place we both love called Roots Yard. And from first glance, I don't know that we might look to think a Catholic marriage would emerge from Rasta vibes. And it makes me think of when people talk about meeting significant others at parties. And it reminds me of something a dear friend of mine, Renard, once said. Renard and I were roommates in our early 20s. So we used to lie a lot. And some night we were talking about going to parties and meeting girls and whatever. And I remember raising a concern, or raising the concern, as I mean, it's a common concern. Even now, I hear so much young people talking about it. But raising the concern about what kind of girl you might meet if you go to a club. And Renard was like, yeah, I hear that. I used to think like that too. But then I started to think more. And look at it. You's a good person. I's a good person. Who's to say the people we meet can't be good too? Whether it's at the club or the party or Roots Yard or wherever, right? Who's to say somebody you meet can't be for you? And it's a stereotype, right? Like we were saying just now, that plenty of young people still talking about it to this day. That meeting people in parties spells trouble automatically. A lot of the time, yes. But that had less to do with where you might have met and more to do with who people are, more to do with like who you are, what your values are, how you intend to treat people, etc. So uncovering our vocations, especially when it comes to marriage, necessarily means that if we want to follow God's call well, we have to experience life, like dating and romance, for example. And we have to take all of that to prayer and be super wise about our decisions through critical reflection. And wisdom is what the voice of God sounds like. I mean, wisdom is God's voice. So when we are able to listen to God, our lives bloom. And we all listen to wisdom differently. Again, we are all so different. And we should all pray for sure, I think. I think prayer, or at least I would advocate for prayer as a non-negotiable. I think is fundamental for your relationship with God. But people do things differently, including pray. People pray differently. And when it comes to listening to the wise voice of God, when it comes to listening to wisdom, plenty people do plenty different things. Some people fast. Some people will go to Eucharistic adoration. Some people might do novenas. Some people might sit down on the front step of their home. We are all different. So when it comes to your vocation, especially if you are called to marriage, I hope you take the time and the energy to critically reflect on what happens in your life. God's voice is very much there, whispering underneath all the loud noise. But we could only hear that voice through intimate conversation. That's why prayer is so important. And remember, your vocation is a lifelong thing, which is why, just like the householder who would bring out things from the storeroom, both new and old, whether in marriage or whatever vocation, whether it's big V, little v, all our experiences from before, especially the wisdom that we would gain from critically reflecting on our experience, we incorporate all of that into our vocations, into our life work. So, again, this is a lifelong thing that we signing up for. The people in the parables, especially the first two parables from today, they gave up everything that they had to enter into their new lives. So we need to try and live our lives as best we can, again, with the old and with the new, bringing down things from old and new in wisdom. So we need to live our lives as best we can through the grace and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And trust that through our own patient discernment, God will lead us exactly where God wants us to be. Whatever your vocations are, God put them in your heart for a reason. And just remember, when you know, you know. Anyways, that's it for me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.